to zoning, planning, and public policy. This is going to be an interesting panel because we've got a pretty diverse group of people here, as you've seen in your outline and your schedules. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves initially first, and then Todd is going to do a kind of an opening introduction on zoning and planning because he's got a pretty unique perspective he'll tell you about. And then Sarah Reynolds is going to do a kind of an update of where we are housing-wise in Colorado. So, David, I'm going to start with you at the end to introduce yourself, who you're with, why you're here, and what you hope to accomplish.
Okay, I'm David Rush. I'm chair of planning and zoning for the city of Walsenburg. And I'm here to let everybody know that you can make tiny homes legal. You can do what we did. It just takes time. And I'm willing to work with any and all of you to make it happen in your community, whatever it takes.
He's a tireless. I know this. Go ahead, Sarah.
I'm Sarah Reynolds. I'm with Housing Colorado, and we are a statewide association of the affordable housing industry here in Colorado. And I'll be doing a few remarks about just what's going on statewide from a funding picture, and certainly some options that are available locally as well.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Electra Johnson, and I am an architectural and urban designer, and I actually got my start working with Tim Van Meter, who was the one who suckered me into getting completely enthusiastic and overly excited about doing infrastructure, affordable housing, and how architecture can transform the built environment and how it can start to solve community issues and social issues. So he's thrown me off the deep end a few times. I'm throwing myself off the deep end right now, but I think we need to open the conversation beyond tiny homes. That's a very important piece. But we also need to talk about other options for solving the affordable housing crisis here in El Paso County because it's necessary and it's a bigger conversation that needs to happen and actions need to happen that address those issues, and they need to happen soon. I'm also running for county commissioner.
Gee, I wonder why.
Hi, my name is Carl Schuler. I'm the Comprehensive Planning Manager for Colorado Springs. I can take whatever notes I can take and try to get answers for you, maybe make a few comments, respond to things. But I'm also going to be making a shameless but entirely appropriate plug for something Jennifer mentioned already, which is our new comp plan for the city. There's a couple cards in the back, there's cards on your table. We're going to be doing a new comprehensive plan for the city. We're just kicking it off. A lot of you will be acting on behalf of constituencies for that. So your input is critically important. I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the agenda today. But again, we're just starting at Mayor Suthers. When he did his State of the City address, he talked about a couple things. One, he talked about the importance of this plan going forward. And he also talked about the importance of affordable housing as part of his presentation. So it all goes together with one more thing, and that is infill. Aubrey Day is in the room. She's one of the folks that work with us on the city's infill plan. That's already done. That's a little bit of a manifesto or a call to action for the city that basically says infill is important, and that all obviously ties into affordable housing.
Very good. Thank you, Carl. Todd?
Thank you, Mike. I'm Todd Lyman with Planning Matters, and it does. I am the founder and principal planner with that firm, and we focus on infill, mixed use, sustainable, and solar responsive, affordable development projects, including recent approvals as recently as last week in Manitou Springs. I'm the former planning director 10 years ago for a period of 6 years in Manitou Springs. So my perspective is a little bit of a west side perspective. I also serve on Careen Toll's Affordable Housing Task Force. We now call ourselves the Housing Task Force in Manitou Springs. But I'm interested in bringing affordable housing all over the region and all up and down the Front Range of Chicago. Thank you very
good, Todd. Okay, so in this sequence, what we're going to do is I'm going to have Todd provide you with kind of a balanced perspective and a quick overview of what someone who spent many, many years as a planner and designer for small communities with NES. And what was that, Todd, for about 10, 20 years you did that? for NES?
Just a couple of years. I came down from Denver
That's
to
it.
work a couple of years and then was recruited as the planning director.
Got it. So he's been on the builder side, but he's also been on the planning side from the city. He's got a very unique perspective, and I met Todd through the Housing Task Force in Manitou Springs, kind of as a business member. I don't live in Manitou Springs, but my daughter does, so I have kind of a proxy that I can use. I don't know, Corinne, can I get away with that with my daughter? And you know what? She's actually renting a cottage unit in Manitou Springs, and it's not a tiny house. I think the thing was built 30 years ago, so, but it's a really nice facility. But Todd, if you want, go ahead and give us a quick overview of where you think we need to head in terms of the zoning, planning, and public policy area, and then we're going to have Sarah give us a quick overview of the situation in Colorado.
Thank you again, Michael. This will be a very quick overview. I would rather hear the rest of the panel speak than myself. I'm going to set the stage for you all, and I want to do it quickly. I want to keep your attention even in the back. The planning hierarchy that exists in the region and across the country is as such. As Carl just mentioned, Colorado Springs is just embarking on the first steps in our new comprehensive plan. Manitou Springs is several months into its new comprehensive plan. I was involved in the creation, I was on the steering committee of the Manitou Springs vision plan 4 years ago. So the overarching planning policy, planning document is the comprehensive plan. Underneath it, here in Colorado Springs, we typically have neighborhood or district master plans. Under that, and the master plans cover not the whole region, a much smaller region. Under that is zoning, and we'll be talking much more about the zoning. And then there is a whole subset of other regulatory provisions that Tim got into a little bit. They include subdivision, and oh, by the way, in the subdivision process, the city or cities in this region collect open space, parks, school fees. And if we're building tiny homes that don't involve school children, maybe there's an opportunity for a waiver of some fees. There are other regulatory systems or regulatory mechanisms even under the zoning, the subdivision, including historic preservation, some hillside regulation, streamside regulation, and other regulations concerning sensitive grounds. So it's a whole spectrum of regulatory environment, and I want to be part of the lead to make that smoother, faster, less expensive for affordable units. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Todd. And Sarah, if you want to come up here, we'll go ahead and get your slides started.
All right, well, I appreciate everyone's attention this morning. I actually have a fairly lengthy PowerPoint. You will be glad to know that I'm not going to be going through all the slides, though. Okay, great. So again, my name is Sarah Reynolds. I'm with Housing Colorado. We're a statewide trade association for the affordable housing industry. And so I'm going to focus really on the funding picture because I think it complements, it sets a really great context for some of the more in-depth land use conversation that's going on this morning. I do want to just acknowledge we do have a number of organizations that are members of Housing Colorado in the room today, so thank you all for your support. The presentation that I'm going to give you is from our Live Affordably Colorado campaign, and it's a communications campaign we started a couple of years ago with the intention of really events like this, where you have a diverse audience and you're trying to set a common framework for the discussion around affordable housing, what the real need is in the state and what some of those solutions are. So you'll be glad to know that this PowerPoint, that you're not going to see the whole thing of, is available on our website. You can download it, so if some of you are asked to speak at meetings in the future, you have that resource. I also have brought with me several copies of our elected officials guide. It is campaign season, you might have noticed. And it's a great opportunity to talk to would-be elected officials about the affordable housing issue and just frame, again, what's going on in the state in a real consistent manner. So just a few stats here. This is probably no news to many of you, but 1 out of every 4 renters in Colorado spends more than 50% of their income on housing. 1 out of 3 children in Colorado live in households with a high housing cost burden, which of course puts other needs at risk. Economic forecast. I think this is actually really relevant when you're talking about local efforts because of the economic development component. Department of Labor estimates that in the next 10 years, 70% of the new jobs in the state are going to have starting incomes of less than $36,000 per year. So in terms of scale and where we're headed, the need for affordable housing is only going to increase. And in fact, that $36,000 already falls below what the incomes needed for your average market rate rent statewide. Just to give you some context on who are these individuals, you can see here a lot of community service workers. These are people that you need to live and work in your community in order for your community to be successful. So you have your teachers, your police officers, EMTs, of course your service industry, your retail clerks, your waiters would fall into that. But what I find striking about this list is how many of these professions require a 4-year degree. These are college-educated workers. This is where a lot of our growth is going to occur job-wise, and they can't afford to live in the communities that they work in. This is not a Denver issue. This is really a statewide issue. And when you look at the table here, which is really hard to read, so again, you'll probably want to go to our website, it shows that with the exception of Pueblo, pretty much every metro area in the state, the wages, average wage and average rent, there's a mismatch. Rent is much higher than the average wage per week. So the problem really is lack of funding. You could certainly do a lot with land use and other local policies, but funding is necessary to really complete the picture. And those land use efforts certainly make those dollars go a lot farther. But obviously, federal funds, I'm going to get into a little bit of that later, have been diminishing. Statewide funds, we've had some success, but there is still a lot of work to be done. And all of these funding sources are at risk for budget cuts. So what is it going to take? Well, again, just to reflect on that scale, right now over 325,000 households right now live where they're paying more than 30% of their income on rent. That's 50% of all renters right now. Again, of those, we've got 1 out of every 4 who are paying more than 50% of their income, but this is the one that really makes me take pause. At our current rate, it'll take over 100 years to fill that gap of housing in terms of what's out there and what's needed. 100 years. That's just the current need. That does not account for population increases, and as you know, Colorado is growing by a net of 100,000 people per year. So this 100 years seems very unsurmountable, and then when you add that population growth, it really puts the problem in perspective. So housing, this is again just kind of an interesting fact about what it means to the local economy. We have done a lot of research with Colorado State University and with the P-Town Foundation, and we've estimated that of all the households that are spending more than 30% of their income on housing in the state, that accounts for $2 billion, not million, $2 billion less in consumer spending, which of course is what drives a lot of the local economy. Local government in Colorado is very dependent on sales tax. So when you take all of that spending out of the local economy, that's a huge impact on local municipal budgets and your ability to provide those services. So that is not a number to disregard by any means. And there's also a lot of benefits that when you have home building, even tiny home building, there is a lot of economic activity generated by that. And there's just some statistics here on how many jobs are supported, as well as how much income and revenue comes back to state and local governments. So let's talk about funding. Current federal resources are, in some cases, they may increase. In some cases, we've seen a lot of decreases. Community Development Block Grants is a big source of funding for affordable housing. And over the past 10 years, that program has been reduced by 30%. Home has had even more cuts. This is another HUD affordable housing funding program. That has been reduced by over 50% over the past 10 years. Now, on the LIHTC, or Federal Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, that has largely held the line, and there's currently a bill by Senator Maria Cantwell out of Washington State to gradually increase the federal LIHTC allocation by as much as 50%. So there's some hope on the horizon that at least in that program area that we will see some growth in federal resources, but it's a very long phased-in approach. And again, when you consider the need in Colorado and the increased demand that we're going to see over the next several years, that is basically just going to offset where we are right now. So in terms of current state resources, we've had a lot of success. And when I started at Housing Colorado 4 years ago, the only state funding source for affordable housing was the governor's budget, and it was the Housing Development Grants line item. At that time, it was $2.25 million, and yes, that was for the entire state. $2.25 million does not go very far. But in the past 4 years, we have increased that dramatically. It now stands at $8.25 million, which is a big increase. It's still not quite enough, but it does show where we've done a little more investing in affordable housing in the state. In 2014, we reinstated the state low-income housing tax credit. So much like the federal tax credit program, the state tax program was funded or modeled in the same way, so that the state resource and that federal resource could be paired together. And we've actually seen tremendous success with that program. That was $5 million, and just this past session, we got that renewed for another 3 years. So we will have $5 million per year over the next 3 years to fund that program. But what about new resources? I mean, you've heard the numbers, the context, the growing population, the job forecast. How many people currently need affordable housing? Those resources, while great, are still not enough. And one of the things that puts Colorado at a very distinct disadvantage compared to our other states is the lack of a dedicated and permanent revenue source for affordable housing funding. Colorado didn't invent high-cost housing. I mean, if you look at other states around the country, New York, Boston, LA, San Francisco, these are all high-cost cities. These are cities that have been grappling with it for a long time, and indeed entire states that have been grappling for quite some time. So this isn't a new concept, but all of those other jurisdictions have what we don't, and that's that dedicated funding source for affordable housing. And so we are really in the minority as a state that doesn't have that. And so we, as Housing Colorado, have been focused on that as really our number one funding priority for the state, is to bring us up to a level with these other growing states around the country and be a little more competitive from a housing market perspective, but also as an economic draw to the state. Obviously, if businesses are looking to relocate to Colorado, one of the bigger things that they look at is what's the housing cost. And if their employees can't afford to buy a home or rent a home, then they're going to look elsewhere. And we're not going to be able to be as competitive with other areas like Raleigh, North Carolina, or Dallas, Texas, or Minneapolis, where their housing costs are much lower, and those are where a lot of those new jobs and those big industry locations are occurring. So this past session, we had a few efforts that at least started the conversation on what a dedicated and permanent funding source might look like. The first was an unclaimed property fund, where we would take an allocation from the state's unclaimed property fund and put it into an affordable housing trust fund. That would have been about $40 million. It was a one-time allocation. Unfortunately, didn't pass the legislature. Another proposal that didn't make it very far, but I do want to just acknowledge Carrie with Independence Center High, who came down and testified on this bill, and that was a statewide real estate transfer tax. This was brought by Senator Ulibarri, who's been a longtime advocate for affordable housing, and this would have placed a referred measure on the statewide ballot in November for a statewide real estate transfer tax. Now that is an incredibly heavy lift from a statewide perspective, but what Senator Ulibarri did was he cited the most common source of funding in other states of how they fund affordable housing trust funds. So that real estate transfer tax, I don't know that we're going to see it come back this session in its same form, but I think what it did allow is that conversation about what a statewide solution could be that was permanent and ongoing. And then the last proposal concerns a document recording fee, or what I think will happen in the next session is going to be a documentary fee, which is a little different. And this is basically a fee that's recorded with all real estate transactions. It's collected by county clerks, and then a percent share of that would go back to a state real estate transfer, a state affordable housing trust fund. So there are options out there, and I think especially in this part of the state, all of you are very aware of what the Taxpayer Bill of Rights does in terms of public finance. It is extremely difficult to pass tax measures at the state level. Property taxes, real estate transfer taxes, all of these things are prohibited by Tabor unless there's a statewide vote. Now, on the local scene, your success rate on tax and spending measures tends to be a lot more successful than the state level. So as we transition and think, all right, we've got some options at the state level that we'll be working on. Obviously, this is a huge problem. It really does take federal, state, and local resources in order to move the needle and have a dramatic impact. So the good news for all of you as local communities, as local governments who are looking at your solutions, is that if you were to go to the ballot with a lodging tax or an accommodation or a mill or a sales tax, which a lot of mountain communities have already done, your success rate stands a much better chance than something we could do at the state. And really we've got some great research from our partners with the Colorado Municipal League where they collect data on what that success level is, and it is actually tremendously encouraging. So I would definitely encourage all local communities to consider that. And then, of course, you have your land use and regulatory environment where you can take those dollars and you can stretch them so that you can get more units for the dollars that you're investing just by looking at some of those regulatory and zoning issues that, again, I think this panel is probably more expert on than I. So with that, I will go ahead and wrap things up. I know there's discussion later. I tried to keep my comments brief. Again, this candidate's guide, I will leave copies in the back of the room so that you can take them with you. And I would just encourage you, no matter who you're talking to, whether it's a candidate for elected office at the local or the state level, or even just some of your civic leaders like your Lions Club or your Kiwanis Club, share this information because it really boils the issues down in a way that's easy to understand, especially for folks who are not expert in affordable housing. So that is all for my comments, and I'll just wait for questions at the end.
Okay, so that kind of shows the depth of the challenges that the state has, and this is unlike any other state in the United States. Every single housing administration, I had some interesting numbers from Seattle. They've gone through a major planning effort, and this is funny, Carl, the new Plan Colorado Springs that you're going through now. I actually had the experience, I guess it was back in 2009, when the city did the Dream City 2020 effort, where they had 300 volunteers that spanned out to talk to 3,000 citizens, and they tried to cull together what they wanted the city of Colorado Springs to be like in the year 2020. So that all of that data, all of those surveys and information is still online. We preserved that from 2009. I had a quick question just before we kind of dive into the planning and zoning part. And I noticed that you've got Plan Colorado Springs with a massive reach to the community. Are you going to put a lot of this information online immediately for people to either comment on or submit information on? Or is it, I hope this isn't going to be an Operation 6035 model where it kind of goes into a chute and then comes out later a couple of years down the road. It would be great if this new Plan Colorado Springs was a live, interactive process. Could you comment on that?
Carl Schuler, it already is. We're just getting it started, but you go online, look at these cards. You can go through what's called Speak Up Colorado Springs, sign on, and immediately start participating. We have an online discussion already. I don't want to take a lot of time to get away from the affordable housing piece, other than to say it's going to all fold into this. But I was down at the What If Festival Saturday, filled up 12 blackboards with people's community vision ideas. That's the sort of thing we're doing, but there's another side to that, and that's what I talk about the on behalf of piece, which is really critical, especially for those of you who represent constituencies. I bet not many of those families, got nice pictures of kids, did some fun stuff, are LMI families. And so the invitation is frankly going out from us, from the mayor, from city council, the steering committee, from the if you want to get involved on behalf of various constituencies, various areas of this community, Southeast Colorado Springs, LMI people, we want that direct connection, but we also realize some of it's representative, some of it is what I call on behalf of.
Very good. I think this is a great effort that you guys are doing to really get the public engaged in the process. So, David, I want to start with you first off question here to provide a quick kind of a summary overview, maybe, a minute or two about what you had to do over 2 years to to get your zoning and coding in place in Walsenburg for your tiny house. And again, we're going to spend additional time on other affordable housing solutions, but we'll kind of wrap up the tiny house here with David's input.
Okay, well, it started out in early 2014. I came up with the idea, and how this all came about was a woman had stopped at the Spanish Beach Library and was trying to find out, that was a good source of information, if small homes could be built in Walsenburg. She and her husband passed through twice a year in the Big Mom motorhome, and they had kind of become acquainted with Walsenburg. What transpired was the last time in 14 when she came through, her husband had died, and she was thinking about retiring from the RV life. And I was there researching the project for planning and zoning, and I overheard the conversation, listened to her, and thought that was a great idea. So I took it on and decided that I was going to run with the idea. So I came up with some wording and approached City Council. They told me, come back to us with a really decent ordinance of what you want, and if we like it, we'll vote on it, and maybe we'll approve it. I came up with an ordinance, and it became 1045, which varied the square footage, less than 800 square feet in an R1 and an R2. Okay, that passed unanimously. Then it handed it right back to me and said, okay, now you've got to come up with everything that's applicable for a tiny home. Square footage, you name it, how it's constructed, how it's going to be. And what we decided very first off was a definition of what a tiny home is. And I'll just read it real quickly. A tiny home is a permanent structure constructed on or off site for one or more persons, year-round living, with a floor area between 100 and 500 square feet inclusive, mounted to a permanent foundation, attached permanently to city utilities with a separate water meter and an applicable separate gas line and meter, that the city building inspector has inspected and for which the city building inspector has issued a certificate of occupancy. That was a real start right there. And then from there we went on and we developed codes and finally approved to follow IRC 2015, mechanical code, plumbing code, electrical code, fire code. All of it took that part took about 2 years, because we're reading all the codes. We were looking around 10,000 pages of code to go through, and that took about 2 years. We finally brought up the ordinance 1092 sometime later, and planning and zoning voted on it and approved it and sent it off to council, and I'll be darned, they voted unanimously. And that became effective July the 21st of this year. Now, that's interesting because we accept tiny homes as a primary residence, not an auxiliary dwelling unit or anything else, as a primary residence. Also auxiliaries like too, or an accessory dwelling unit. So as far as I know, I don't know anyone in the nation that's been primary.
Very good, thanks, David. Quick question, Carl, just as a bounce for the IRC. I assume that the city of Colorado Springs accepts IRC building codes for its buildings for residential construction. Is that a standard international code that's applied here locally?
I think something that's important to recognize is A, I'm not an expert on building codes, but also B, in our whole region, we have what's called the Regional Building Division, and so we have department. So all of our building code stuff is done by intergovernmental agreement with a separate entity. So when the city does that, its name is Manitou Springs, really. So those building codes end up being adopted essentially for the whole region.
Got it. Electric, you have a point?
Yeah, I wanted to make a point about, to bring the conversation of tiny homes, just because I was involved in that. It came out of a PATH conversation because we have an homeless crisis right now that's been panhandling homeless, however you want to talk about it. It's basically a housing crisis. And we have 0 low barrier beds over as soon as like our warming shelter closed last year. So that's why the focus, I think, is on tiny homes here, because it's temporary transitional housing. There are some solutions that have been done. I visited one in Austin, Texas, that was a campground, essentially. However, I want to say, so Tim Van Meter, years ago, we were working in, he was on a phone call, and he said, we were the experts in form-based codes. This was probably 15 years ago. And then he hung up the phone and said, Electra, I have a book for you to read. You're writing the form-based codes for the city of Dallas. And we did that, and we won awards for it. Now, Colorado Springs is somewhere between Dallas and Walsenburg, okay? So we have issues that need to be addressed that are somewhere between Dallas and Walsenburg about the affordable housing issue. Tiny homes are one solution that can be set up as a land trust, which they're doing for TOD housing, and Tim's working on that in Denver, to hold land for later development, but to fix and start to create solutions to the affordable housing crisis. We need to really look at all the tools in our toolkit. We need to look at, we're going to look at tiny, we need to look at micro dwelling units in apartments and things like that, as well as mixed use, mixed income housing, and do what we did in Dallas and in Houston and all over the country, create overlay districts that start to allow and address infill and start to create greater density of housing. But with density comes the issue of transport, comes a lot of other issues. And in this city, in this county, we have big city problems, and we need to look at them with a big city mentality and change the lens from the small town mentality that we've been looking at them from. So I think we have the problem defined, and now we need to basically bust out the toolkit and look at every possible solution, from land trust to co-housing communities for veterans and for military families, to across the board, to mixed income, mixed age, mixed use development.
Very good. Electra, would you be in favor of looking at pilot projects or commercial demonstrations of alternative housing solutions?
I think we have to.
That's
And honestly, I can't do anything until I'm elected.
I didn't think it was going to be overly political. We're going to probably go another 5, so we're still rolling. Todd, you had a comment to that?
Yes. I'd like to go back to something that Chuck Murphy mentioned earlier and that Tim alluded to in his opening remarks, and that is the cost of the process, not just the fees, which I mentioned earlier. We need to be working on the fees, but it's the time value of money. It's the levels of review. I mean, Manitou Springs, for 6 years, I administered a program that I think in this region seemed overly regulatory, because you could get through staff review and planning commission and even city council, but in Manitou Springs there are 14 or 15 historic districts. Half of all the structures in Manitou Springs, don't get me wrong, I love Manitou Springs, I love the history of Manitou Springs, I love the people who live in Manitou Springs. Oh, Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C, D, E. And the time of getting through that process and the frustration of having an accessory dwelling unit approved by the Historic Preservation Commission and not approved by the Planning Commission is painful. I continue to work on that project. I won't give up. So there are plenty of fees. There are plenty of fees that we can adjust. And I hope that Carl will take the lead there for Colorado Springs.
Let me follow that up with but let's streamline. Let's trust our planning staff and send the note cards, the postcards out to the impacted neighbors. Let's please not send them 500 or 1,000 feet. The area of a circle it's pi r squared. It's not just
If you go from 100 feet to 200 feet, it's not just double the number of neighbors who are being notified, it's 3 or 4 times the number of neighbors. Let's keep the process focused on what it is that we want to accomplish and streamline where we can. I trust Carl. I think Colorado Springs ought to trust Carl and his colleagues. I would make so much of what we are now sending to City Council. Some of it has to go there if it's rezoning. I understand that's charter-based. We're probably not even amending the charter, but let's use staff. Let's work with the neighbors, and where we can, let's allow City Council to delegate to the Planning Commission and to others to make it 1 or 2 stops instead of 2 or 3 stops.
I think it might bring some help to the planning staff in Colorado Springs. Carl, this infill plan that you guys just recently put together was really good. I mean, it was really well written and well designed. There was one section here that I thought was pretty interesting. It might be an opening for some of these pilots and commercial. It says, the city and its enterprises own to various degrees maintain over 1/4 of all the property within our city limits. How the city invests in, uses, maintains, and administers and regulates the property will have a significant impact on private land use choices. The city also has an undeniable role in the regulation of land use, the administration of zoning, the development of policy and procedures, impacting the development process, and in the enforcement of standards that have established to maintain beauty and quality of life. Would you be willing, through this, not only infill, now that you've got kind of a draft program in place, but now with the plan Colorado Springs and now kind of opening the doors to ideas and concepts, could we put forth pilot projects and commercial demonstrations where we can bend and tweak and calibrate some of these codes, but do it in a monitored process? That means everybody's working towards a goal of seeing whether or not it's sustainable or not. And then we can go through that process and provide you, the planning department, with feedback and updates and information. Because I think getting started somewhere is the key. We've got to get started. And if we wait for a plan to be done in the future, we basically have lost some time. Is that a possibility?
Yes.
No.
The correct answer is a qualified yes. As part of the infill plan, which is already adopted, there was a kind of a mantra or a notion that we can't have a complete pause for planning. One of our former mayors really didn't like the idea of pausing for planning. This mayor is really a big proponent of planning and that orderly process, but when you get an idea that seems to make sense, you move forward with it. And we do that in various fronts, various places. We have a code subcommittee. It's a pretty challenging process where, as we speak, we're working on this stuff. So, for example, one of our next activities is to take on ADUs. We allow ADUs. It was on one of those charts in what's called the R2 zone, which is a 2-family zone. But our biggest zone in the city right now is the R1 zone, which is 6,000 square foot single-family zone. And that'll be something we'll be doing. We're not waiting for the plan to get done before we go into that approach. Another thing the infill plan talked about is some of these utility tap fee sorts of things, extensions. We had a situation in the city until recently where you couldn't transfer tap fees from one property to another. We now have a limited ability that sort of has to be transferred internally. You can't take the center of the city, take that value of that tap fee and shift it out to a greenfield area, but you can do it kind of in the reverse. We also had a situation where your tap fee for utilities, if it went for a certain period of time, it lapsed and you had to pay it again. We tweaked that over many years, and finally City Council and the Utilities Board said, let's forget that entirely. So just in the last year or so, we now have a situation where that very expensive cost to enter, which is a tap fee, and I want to talk about that really briefly, you don't have to pay that again. If you paid it once for your property, even if it's sat there for 10 years, vacant, so that really helps the infill and the redevelopment kind of a situation. I do want to push back a little bit because it's going to be a community discussion on that tap fee issue, on that developer pay issue, because under Tabor, under our expectations as a community, we would like basically kind of a developer pay concept so that on utilities, for example, we have $2 or $3 billion worth of bonded indebtedness, including $900 million for our SDS project. And the idea is when a new development comes in, whether that's a live in a new house or 500 apartments or a whole development project, they're supposed to pay their fair share of that you've already invested, that the rest of our community has put in for our utilities, our roads, and so that's the dilemma, that's the public policy dilemma that all the elected officials have. But one of the things that we did in the info plan is we talked about if that cost to enter is really smaller because you already have a lot of the existing infrastructure there, or your footprint. You've got a really small unit. You could do a tiny home, you could do a very tiny multifamily. Should that cost to enter, it's already smaller, but could it be even less? Because honestly, you're not taking as much of a share of that infrastructure, which is really expensive. 5,400 lane miles of roads are really expensive. Billions of dollars worth of utility infrastructure are an expensive investment. But if you're doing that in micro housing, you're doing a small piece of it. We're still working on tweaking that. The subsidy piece is a different one, which means that if you say that's an important community value, we think because it's so important that it should, on a calculus basis, pay less than its share. That's different. So that it's going to be approached from both fronts.
So there could be a committee for utilities extension to ADUs that kind of evolves and develops. If that is going to happen, I absolutely.
We've done some of it. It's already been proposed to some degree, but part of it is that is your imprint as a cost to enter really smaller because you're having less of a...
And I think if you turn to industry, they will come up with those solutions and make those standards and those building codes. Before that talk, David, I wanted to ask, you guys did some innovations with the proposed and developing Walsenburg tiny home project. You got was it a 1 to 6 tap fees, or was that the one in Salida that you guys pursued?
I believe that's the one that's Salida.
Right, so that what a 1 in 6 tap fee means is that the utility would only be charging one fee that could provision utilities to 6 homes. And that was a serious reduction in terms of the overall cost. Because every time you do a housing development, you have these tap fees for gas, for water, for electric, for waste. So this is what drives the cost up. And why we're so interested in ADUs, that if you already have all the utilities, all we're talking about is a coded and standardized extension of those utilities to that dwelling unit. And if we can get that done, then we might have a baseline to work on a tiny home clustering model that says, hey, could I have a utilities demarcation point on the property, bring the utilities to that point, and then take care of it from there? I know that might be a stretch. That's a qualified no, I think. Okay, go ahead, Tom.
Well, I'd like to, again, bring to this panel something that Chuck mentioned in his, and that is, can we distinguish between even the tiny house profit or private sector developer versus the nonprofit developer? Can't we pluck that fruit pretty quickly and say, we can waive most of this for a nonprofit because they're providing a service or a multitude of services. Already, that's their fee. We're honoring their service, whatever that service might be.
We're getting tight.
If I can keep the mic for just 1 or 2 more points. How many people here had the opportunity to attend the Art Space Live, Work, Affordable Housing public meeting a week or 2 weeks ago? A few hands. We can all go on ArtSpace. I don't have a handout. We can all go into artspace.org. They are a nonprofit, and they develop 20 to 100 housing units, principally for artists, but I think they define artists as artists or other creatives pretty broadly. ArtSpace is working with, remind me, Bob Wolfson, and I think he has a website already. They are looking for a space. In my mind, it could be 2 spaces if one space doesn't work out. And because they are a .org, they are a nonprofit, their mission is to maintain affordability in perpetuity. So long as they exist out of Minneapolis, but they're setting up a headquarters in Denver.
I think they've done about, 35 locations around the country?
They are at up to 40 locations. and they have regional headquarters in New York. They do projects. all
We
over.
can get some information up on the
Yeah.
website on that after. I do have one question for Sarah real quick. Sarah, are you familiar with the Blueprint 2.0 initiative by the governor for the OEDIT grant? We do have 3 communities in Colorado, Pagosa Springs, Steamboat Springs, and Morgan County, that are going to be part of the tiny home community development grant. There's going to be grant money available from the state. Can you talk to that at all, or just provide a quick overview of the Blueprint? And I know we're getting pushed off the stage here.
Well, good news, I actually don't have much information on that, so.
All right. That answers that
If
question.
you're yanked off stage or talking too much about that, because I'm actually not familiar with that program.
Okay. The Tiny Home Industry Association is actively involved with that. I think they got involved with the governor early on, about 6, 7, 8 months ago. So I think there's going to be a rollout of some strategies where they're going to go visit those 3 communities, and they're going to try to roll up some type of tiny home community model. And it might be micro homes. It might be micro homes on foundations. I think, Electra, your point is well taken about it's got to be a whole broad brush of home strategies in terms of addressing low cost and affordable housing. So right now, we're kind of at the end of this. I do have one question from one of the audience members that I think you might all find interesting. It says, considering condos are typically more affordable than standard residences, what steps are being taken locally to overcome builder hesitation related to the state's condo deficit law, or defect law, sorry?
I can answer that very generally. I wasn't involved in it, although it actually, in the infill plan, we talked about that. The construction defects issue is a major issue. It was identified as part of the infill process under Jill Gabriel, one of our city council folks. City council has taken some action, done an ordinance on that. There's still some attempts at the state level to kind of balance the important rights of homeowners, property owners, with what was really a system that for a period of time was really sterilizing a piece of the market. So it's being taken very seriously by this local community, and there was some regulatory action taken by our city council.
Will that be addressed in the codes committee? Because I know that's
It's already done on our side. I'm not sure that we can do much more locally. I'm not the expert on it. There may be some things that occur at the state level, again, to balance that kind of the importance of property owners' rights versus the ability to get stuff done.
Got another question for you, Carl. You're the man of the hour here, apparently. This is on a yellow card, so this is really yellow brick card. What can be done about park fees on infill projects? Where is this with City Council?
That's another one we're working on. Again, I'm the messenger. We've got other folks. When I start talking about this stuff, people are probably going to say, Carl, why'd you say that? But we are redoing the parkland dedication ordinance. It's been a challenge with all the various things that have occurred with parks, but it's happening as we speak. And what we might present, ultimately, it'll be up to City Council to do this, talked about pilots, is start with a pilot.
Excellent.
And with infill and potentially with downtown. But Parks, and you know who he is, he's heading that up right now. We've had a number of meetings about that, and so that's another one that's in the infill plan, and it is moving forward.
Very good. Thank you, Carl. Any other last comments from our panel members all the way back from this side? David, real quick. Any last
Just
words?
real quick, as I said earlier in the beginning, I'm willing to work with anybody. I'll give you my email address and phone number, because pretty much everybody else in the country must have it by now anyway. It is DJROESCH @flash, FLASH.net.
Very good. Thank you, David. Sarah?
Nothing for me.
Okay. Electra? Campaign pitch? Maybe not.
What I do want to say is that from what Sarah said earlier, that we are in a big transition. We need to start looking towards the future. And the future, what I'm really concerned about is the future that we're handing down to our kids. And as a result, what I'd really like to see at a county and city level is comprehensive planning that's 30 to 50 years out, that looks at growth trends and looks at real issues. And also bases them on the real facts. We have a water issue in West. Obviously, there's 40 million people in 18 states that depend on the waterfront that comes from Colorado. Our comprehensive plan at the county needs to start with a water plan And it needs to start with infrastructure, how much we can provide and how we can do that in an affordable way that serves all segments of society and mixes and does it in a smart way that mixes uses, mixes incomes, mixes ages, and creates a vibrant community. That is what Colorado Springs and Colorado and El Paso County really is about. I'd also like to see how the county and the city can work forward to create efficiencies and start to make these plans with, and not just the county and city, I'm not just talking about Colorado Springs because there's more cities in Colorado Springs. There's also Manitou, there's Green Mountain Falls, there's Palmer Lake. There's a lot of other areas that need to be included in that conversation, and that growth plan needs to be in conjunction with all of those areas. So that's what I'm hoping that we can do into the future to help guide our pathway so that we're doing it with smart ideas and we're not dumping it on the shoulders of future generations. Thank you.
Thank you. Carl, you want to give everyone your cell phone number? Oh, no.
There are ways to contact me on this plan COS card, so I'm not worried about that. Again, if you really have an abiding interest in this, we have stakeholder interviews, we have the ability to be a co-creator of this plan. I wanted to leave you with a couple numbers though, just because I'm kind of a big picture guy. 200,000 is one of my numbers, 120,000 is another one, 80,000 is another one. We have 200,000 dwelling units in this city roughly right now. So a lot of the solution, a lot of the approach to affordable housing is not necessarily building the new ones, it's managing what we already have. It took us 144 years in Colorado Springs, scale this up to the region if you want, to get to where we are, although 90% of that's occurred in the last 66 years. Those are big numbers. Throw one more number out really quickly, just because it's something to think about. $7,000 or $8,000 a month, you're looking at 1,500, those kind of numbers. It costs $7,000 or $8,000 a month to have somebody in a skilled nursing facility in this city. As people like me age up, if we could even take 10% of that and have those folks age in place in our community, it's a huge number.
That's this alternative residential flipping strategy. I think it's got.
I could give you some more numbers, but I've talked enough of it.
Quick, Todd.
Very quickly, I'm going to reference the question from Senator Michael Merrifield. How did we, as a region and as a nation, forget about the small multifamilies, the duplexes, the threeplexes, the fourplexes? I had this conversation. My younger brother has Carl's position down in Santa Fe, long-range planning director, and that's his perspective. It's like, how did we forget this? This affordable, one-off, beautifully, easily accommodated development pattern.